Is it a cause for concern? Some say, emerging markets can't help it. They need infrastructure. They need money.
But I think you need to think of debt maybe as a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, debt enables development, right? It enables households to have better living standards, companies to do capital investments, governments, as you say, to build infrastructure, ports, roads, education, and so on. The trick is finding that balance, right? Sort of taking on debt, but being able to sort of manage it well, even in situations where, for example, financial markets are volatile. That's what we're really concerned about. This debt builds up very quickly, and what happens when we have more volatile market conditions?
The question really is, how do you strike the balance? How do you get that balance? I mean, when you talk about debt accumulation, we've seen something like, $70 trillion over the last 10 years.
Yeah. I think, and that's part of you mentioned the ADB meetings here in Fiji, and that's a lot of what the discussion has been about. What are the right policy settings? What's the right policy framework to be able to manage this debt successfully? So you've got to have a good structure in place. You have to have good governance about the debt you're taking on. And I think one key aspect is transparency in lending. It needs to be clear to the general public, to the IMF and the authorities, exactly what's going on as this debt is accumulated.
China has been, I guess, disbursing loans to emerging markets and emerging markets economies. How transparent has China been?
Well, I think, it's fair to say that the whole Belt and Road Initiative is conducted in perhaps a different way than traditional development finance. And anytime you have kind of a new pattern like that, there are going to be question marks about exactly how it's being done. I think to many observers, it's not always clear exactly what's being lent, how much is being lent, and what the terms are, whether it's collateralized in some sense or whether there are government guarantees. And so what the arrangements might be if, for example, a country can't repay its debts.
Isn't it true, though, that when it comes to sustainability and transparency, it's not just about the loans from China, it's pretty much across the board?
No, not at all. And I think you bring up an interesting point, because one of the things that's happening is the creditors have changed dramatically over the years, right? Think a decade ago, it was mostly the multilateral development banks or major bilateral creditors like the US, UK, what have you, lending at concessional rates, very low interest rates to these countries. But now there are far more commercial creditors. A lot of the debt is bonds, that's at commercial rates. So the kind of payback mechanisms are different, and China is a good chunk of this, right? China went from virtually nothing in lending a decade ago to 15-20% of this type of lending to low-income countries now.
So what are the implications in terms of growth going forward? Because Christine Lagarde of the IMF says that we're actually sowing the seeds of the next crisis.
So, you might think of it in sort of wonky economic terms as marginal returns, right? So debt helps. Debt funds investment. Debt funds growth. You take on debt to spur growth. But at a certain point, you've got so much debt that it becomes sort of a weight on the economy. You have to spend a lot of money paying it back and refinancing it. And that's money that you can't use for normal public services or infrastructure projects or what have you. So it's finding that balance again between taking on enough debt to keep your economy growing at a good pace and taking on so much debt that you weigh down your growth prospects.
From where you're seated, where are the vulnerabilities? Which economies are most at risk?
So, in some sense, a lot of what's going on here in Asia is related to maintaining growth. And by and large, Asian economies are growing at quite a good pace. Some of the problems are in very vulnerable, low-income countries. And in fact, I'd probably focus most on those countries perhaps that had debt relief in the past and have accumulated debt again. In the region, I think some of the Pacific Island countries, Tonga, for example, has had trouble both related to accumulation of debt and sort of many of these countries have had environmental problems that have been expensive and had to deal with and have been impacting their budgets. But I think some of the biggest problems are in countries that are very poor to begin with and have had new access to finance over the past decade or so, whether that's because interest rates are so low and investors want high returns, or because countries like China are lending in a new way to these lower income countries.